Hey y'all! So now that the Bee movie has become like the biggest cinematic joke of the decade, I watched it again about a month ago to see how bad it really was. Spoiler alert, it's really bad. But it also made me think that we, humans are really quite horrible to bees. We just had that big scare with colony collapse disorder a couple of years ago where like half the bees just died. And what has changed since then? Exactly. Anyways, I decided to do my part in helping to hashtag save the bees, so guess what? I started my own beehive. Yes, ladies, yes, gents, yes to all of our non binary friends, your girl is now an amateur beekeeper. Unlike all those performative activists who just post about saving the bees, I'm raising awareness and actually saving the bees. I really think this will make a huge difference, the kind of difference that is just so good for the earth, right? That's what we think, at least. But could it be that hashtag Save the Bees is one of the most misunderstood initiatives to date? Much of the momentum of this movement comes from the notion that without bees, we're completely screwed. Bees play a crucial role in food production because of their pollination abilities, which allow crops to reproduce. In fact, research estimates that pollinators are responsible for creating 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat. Bees also play a role in making products we use, like beeswax and honey. Some people apparently even see bees as a tasty snack. But even as we see all of this passion for bees and their preservation, be it for our sake or for the sake of the environment, how much do we actually know about bees? Let me ask you a question. How many different species of bees do you think there are in the US? 4,000. If you got it wrong, you're not alone. A recent study found that only 14% of participants could even come close to guessing the right answer, even though 99% of participants believed bees were important and needed to be preserved. This is not a trivial question. The honeybees we think of when we talk about bees in general are but one single species, the European honeybee. They're wholly different from the native wild bees supporting the local ecosystems. Most honeybees in the US actually originate from Europe. When the colonizers brought them over during the Columbian Exchange, the natives called them the white man's flies. Honeybees are highly social, working in groups and living in large hives, while native bees, on the other hand, include species that are solitary creatures. They build their own nests, meeting with other bees only to mate and separating shortly thereafter. Honeybees are also more likely to sting people, since worker bees have large stingers in order to protect their hives, whereas wild bees tend to be less aggressive. Some are stingless altogether, many others have such tiny stingers that they can't break through the human skin barrier. As well, many native bees display a much wider variety of colors than the black and yellow stripes we find on striped honeybees. Sweat bees, for instance, can be blue, copper, and gold. They're named after their habit of landing on humans to feed on their sweat for salt. When it comes to food, honeybees are generalists, meaning that they feed on anything they can find. In contrast, about 20% of native wild bee species are specialists, meaning they feed on only 1 to 3 types of plants. These bees have co evolved with their partner plants. For example, specialist bees who feed on the evening primrose have developed reduced hairs in order to more effectively pick up the unusually shaped pollen in the flowers. These pollinator plant relationships form the foundation of an ecosystem. Wild bees are responsible for making sure that the native plant varieties flourish, thereby supporting the food source of other organisms in the ecosystem.
The most significant distinction between honeybees and wild bees is the relationship they have with us humans. Honeybees are fundamentally livestock. The intimate entanglement between honeybee and farm manifests most clearly in their very own biology. Over the last century alone, honeybees have developed exoskeletons twice as thick as their ancestors. They are also 1/3 larger in size, sport more hair, and have a reshaped digestive tract. Overall, their lifespan has shortened by 15%. Honeybees have undergone changes in social organization too. Each hive has fewer guard bees and experiences a shortened or even non-existent hibernation season now. Behaviorally, honeybees have become more docile and productive at making honey. It's almost like they've been selectively bred and designed to fit the needs and convenience of humans. Most of the 2.5 million honeybee colonies in the US are not only intensively managed, but also bound to agricultural production. Nearly 2/3 of these colonies are woven into cross-country circuits of migratory pollination, or what I like to call rent-a-bee. The honeybee colonies spend early winter in the south being fed high fructose corn syrup, sugar water, or protein patties by commercial beekeepers in order to grow their population. In February, most travel by truck to California to pollinate almond orchards. Some go to apple orchards in Washington state, some go to citrus groves in Florida, and others yet go to blueberry farms in Maine. This essentially describes the process by which beekeepers rent out their bees to other agricultural producers for pollination services. Therefore, colony numbers fluctuate largely due to demand and price. Demand and price for pollination contracts, for honey, for wax. Other market forces, like governmental subsidies for example, also influence colony numbers. In fact, researchers suggest that honeybee populations have declined in part because of competition from imported honey, cheap sugar, and sugar substitutes, rather than from ecological reasons alone. But ecological reasons for bee decline do exist, and at quite a cost. Due to climate change, the bloom calendar has shifted so much that in the northeast regions of the United States, some flowers bloom an average of 2 weeks earlier than it did just 2 generations ago. Fields have been replaced by monoculture crops and buildings, severely limiting the amount of forage available to both honeybees and wild bees, forcing them to fly longer distances and for longer periods of time in search for potentially less nutritious meals. Moreover, the deadly Varroa destructor mite, a parasite that attacks bees, was introduced to the United States in the 80s. The bees are now both victims and vectors of these mites, which pose a severe threat to a colony's survival. Widely used pesticides further weaken the bees' immune systems, and depending on the state of the bee's health at the time of contact, the pesticide could even result in immediate death. While it's true that these factors harm both honeybees and wild bees, the difference is that honeybees have an entire industry working to ensure their survival. Commercial beekeepers strategically breed enough honeybees to compensate for mortality rates. Scientists are continuing to develop better dietary supplements and pest controls, while broader governmental research conducted on pollinator health preferentially focuses on honeybees. All in all, the chances of honeybee extinction are slim to none. Wild bees, on the other hand, have only themselves. And due to ongoing neglect, a 2010 report conducted by the United Nations Environmental Program reported that 1 in 4 wild bee species in the US alone are at risk for extinction. Yet, ironically enough, these are the species that do most of the pollination required to maintain a healthy ecosystem. For example, past studies have found that native bee populations, when robust enough, can provide full pollination services without the help of honeybees at all, even for high pollination requirement crops like watermelon. However, native bees increased yields for blueberry crops even when honeybee pollination services were employed. It makes sense that native bees are more efficient pollinators than honeybees. Since they don't make honey, they hold on to much less of the pollen they collect. The way that mainstream conservation efforts completely sideline wild bees opens up not just the mere possibility, but the probability that these vital pollinators are dying right under our noses. A study published in 2015 found that Aledo, a neonicotinoid insecticide applied to the seeds of flowering crops, reduced greatly wild bee density, solitary bee nesting, and bumblebee colony growth and reproduction. But surprisingly, it had no significant effect on honeybee colonies. Honeybee health, therefore, is not representative of wild bee health. Therein lies the problem with mainstream Save the Bee efforts. It neglects the populations that most desperately need help while offering a cheap shot of self-righteous satisfaction that removes any incentive to realize it.
To make matters worse, the rise of hobbyist beekeeping in an effort to save the bees only exacerbates the existing ecological stressors faced by wild bees. Currently, several key components of hobbyist beekeeping have resulted in serious consequences for native wild bees. All of them tie back to the increased competition brought by a greater honeybee population. In order to expound upon the wider implications of these practices, we will employ a case study format hypothetical situation. Consider the Bombus impatiens species of bee, a prolific pollinator of tomato plants. These bees are used by commercial groups with greenhouses in order to pollinate their plants. Several key aspects are important here. Number 1. Bombus impatiens is supplied with sugar water by humans in order to supply nectar needs. It is important to classify pollination and nectar collection as separate actions, as not all pollinations result in nectar collection, and for some species of bees, such as carpenter bees, nectar collection may occur without pollination as well. Number 2. Other pollinators are discouraged from entry into this greenhouse by ensuring that the Bombus impatiens hive is the only point of entry to said greenhouse. The Bombus impatiens bee in this case would be analogous to the native wild bees in a larger ecosystem. Perhaps for a moment we may imagine a world where a human worker leaves the door open, consistently and prolifically relative to this smaller environment. This may introduce honeybees into the greenhouse, which in a larger ecosystem often function as an invasive species for native wild bees. The honeybee's ability to generalize is a somewhat double-edged sword. Like we mentioned before, there's a trade-off between pollination efficacy and honey production. Even if both bees receive assistance from humans, the Bombus impatiens loses out for several reasons. In the short term, the honeybees consume some of the plant's pollen, thus reducing the amount of food available to the Bombus impatiens. This negatively impacts the ability of the more specialized species, the Bombus impatiens in this case, to pollinate the tomato plants in the future. Of importance as well is the fact that these plants are now being pollinated less effectively, that is, both at a slower rate and less efficiently, resulting in less tomato plant reproduction in the long term. Especially for plants in the wild, away from the watchful domestication of humans, interference from honeybees can lead to a decline in certain flora, which then leads to a further decline in wild bee populations, thereby setting off a destructive cycle of ecological breakdown. To visualize this sort of ecological breakdown, let us consider the Macropus nuda bee. These bees are, similarly to the Bombus impatiens species, highly specialized pollinators that fulfill their nectar needs separately from the plant that they depend on for pollen. There is currently no commercial or economic incentive to domesticate these bees, as the plant upon which they depend on, the spotted loosestrife, is in fact a weed. In situations where humans clear away this weed for perhaps a hypothetical rose garden, the introduction of a honeybee hive can be disastrous. The honeybees would again choke out the competition by inefficiently pollinating the remaining flowers and leaving less pollen for the Macropus nuda to use when laying its eggs. Critically, pollen from the spotted loosestrife is the only type of pollen this bee uses when providing food for its larvae. As a result, the Macropus nuda is driven away from the immediate environment, or, in some cases, driven to catastrophic population decrease. The Lorax-type departure of the most effective pollinator devastates plant life throughout the ecosystem, and other animals, especially ones that rely on this particular plant, are now left with reduced resource. In this way, interspecies relationships cultivated over millions of years of evolution are upset for the sake of momentary glory and artisanal honey. This in turn circles back to affect that same beehive that was introduced to the environment. Reduced plant pollination and reproduction can starve a hive. Unfortunately, not many hobbyist beekeepers stick it out when things get tough. One source reported that most amateurs quit within 5 years. Further evidence that this practice isn't sustainable.
So what can we do to help? First off, let's recognize the different approaches for honeybee and wild bee conservation. Honeybee conservation primarily falls on government support and agricultural practices. The government should provide technical and financial assistance to honey producers and encourage agricultural changes, such as planting more cover crops, wildflowers, and native grasses, creating a buffer between farmland and non-grazing land, and reducing pesticide use, especially during periods of high honeybee activity. This in turn will help other pollinators, reduce erosion, control invasive species, and improve agricultural efficiency. For the public, honeybee conservation pollinates our food crops, improves water quality, soil quality, and wildlife habitat. For native and wild bees, the greatest threats are habitat loss and fragmentation, climate change, invasive species, pesticides, and a general lack of research to differentiate them from honey or bumblebees. Bees
Bees actually appear to adapt well to some human-disturbed anthropogenic habitats, like gardens or agricultural grasslands. However, other examples like temperate forests support few bees, so we should preserve and manage ecosystems that support more wild bee populations. Providing a variety of native flowering trees, shrubs, and wildflowers that bloom throughout different seasons in your personal garden can also help wild bees. You can also reduce the size of lawn, allow more wildflowers to grow in your yard, and perhaps reduce the amount you weed. For home gardeners, try choosing non-chemical solutions to prevent insect problems and provide a source of pesticide-free water and mud. Other than planting a pollinator garden, you can build or buy your own bee homes to provide nesting habitats, such as bare soil posts here and there, sand piles, standing dead trees, or stump or log. You can also drill holes in old post or tree trunk, like a birdhouse but for bees. Lastly, continue supporting climate action and mitigation efforts at the local and national level. Bees, along with many other species, cannot adapt fast enough to changing seasons, flowering patterns, and the climate. But there you go! The government and agricultural industry should address honeybee conservation, while you can take care of native wild bees around your current or future home.
Humans, are really quite horrible to bees. We just had that big scare with colony collapse disorder a couple years ago, where like half the bees just died. And what has changed since then? Exactly. Anyways, I decided to do my part in helping to #SaveTheBees, so guess what? I started my own beehive. Yes, your girl is now an amateur beekeeper. Unlike all those performative activists who just post about saving the bees, I'm raising awareness and actually saving the bees. I really think this will make a huge difference, the kind of difference that is just so good for the earth, right?